Okay, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, once again, welcome back to your latest episode of the Hilltop Workshop. On the bench today, Rochester QuadraJet. This is one of the earlier models, popular on earlier Monaros, Chevys, bits and pieces like that. I'm going to be doing a complete overhaul on this one, so it's going to be stripped right down to bare bones, ultrasonically cleaned. The throttle shaft is going to be rebushed. And hopefully we'll come back with a very, very shiny, new, lovely looking carburetor. I have already had this one apart. It's not in too bad a condition. We can see from some of the linkages that some people have had a bit of a crack at it along its life. And some things are not quite the way they're supposed to be, but we're going to fix all of that. One thing I do look for on these in the beginning is to see if this little plug here has been removed. Behind that plug is a little adjustment screw that adjusts the cruise point for the needles for the main circuit. So with that you can actually make a little bit of an adjustment to your cruise mixture, but of course it goes without saying that as soon as you do that you're going away from the manufacturer's specification, ignoring any emissions and regulations, yada yada yada. So, but anyway, I've got what I believe will be all the tools that I need. To the right I've got my mesh basket going to the ultrasonic, and on the left hand side I have a plastic tub where I'll put the few pieces of this that will not fare so well in the ultrasonic. So yeah, let's get down to it. So like any other carburetor, when I'm pulling it apart, start by pulling off all the ancillary external bits and pieces that we can do without. So things like our idle solenoid or idle up solenoids, they can come off fairly early in the game. So this solenoid here, obviously the electrical part of it will not be going into the ultrasonic, but the bracket and the nut of course can. So the rest of it I'll be sticking into the plastic tub, and I'll give that a bit of a hand clean later on. The CPA diaphragm on this carburetor I'll test just to make sure it's okay. I'm pretty sure it's a good one. The hose here, we'll reuse that because it's originally bent and it's taken form from all the years of heat. It's still pliable, it's still flexible, so I've got no problem reusing that hose. Again, it'll just get a hand clean. You can probably hear an aircraft in the background at the moment. That's probably one of those Globemasters from the RAF base that's a few K from here. So we can see that capsule is holding vacuum nicely. It's pulled back to where it should be. Obviously it's out of adjustment, but it's holding vacuum, so we don't need to replace that. That's going to be just fine. So this one can come off. Obviously the screws will go into the tub, into the ultrasonic. The capsule obviously doesn't. But one thing about this, the linkage can, one thing about these capsules is that the way they're affixed is just with these two little metal tangs that get bent over to hold it into this bracket. A lot of the time when you try to bend these too much, they end up snapping off. So for the state and the condition that that's in, I'm not going to bother to try and take it off because I'll probably just end up breaking that. So I'll clean that up by hand later on. Now the choke housing, you can see the choke covers being put in a bit of a lean position. 9 times out of 10, these will work perfectly well in the original factory position. 9 times out of 10, if you use factory settings, you're going to be pretty safe. Okay, so we've got a bit of corrosion in there, a bit of rust. Obviously it draws exhaust fumes through here out of the exhaust manifold, so you're going to get a bit of crap in there. That whole unit there can go in the ultrasonic. There's nothing that's going to melt down or decompose from that. Choke housing seems to be in perfectly fine order. I'll bring back our stand and we'll start attacking the lid. We'll take the accelerator pump linkage out. It's done quite simply with the right size punch, a little baby hammer, and just tap it in as far as she'll go. That'll take the linkage out and that can just stay like so. You can pull that bit off if you like. Once you're at this stage, the only other piece left to be undone is the choke flap linkage. One screw on the side, a bit of a tap, a bit of a twist to disengage it from the lever underneath here, and out she comes. And from there we are pretty much ready to take the lid off. Plenty of screws to hold these lids down. No less than 5 screws that surround the primaries and the fuel bowl area, as well as the 2 bolts that affix it to the inlet manifold, which means that when you're fitting these carburetors, over tightening them using the studs that hold them down will result in damage, and I'll show you exactly what that damage can be. Okay, so our lid's pretty much ready to come off now. So, 5 screws holding that down, plenty of tension and plenty of mating surfaces on here to keep that sealed. But, now I'm hoping you'll be able to see this, but there's probably a good millimetre of warpage and distortion in that lid. Now that occurs by people being overzealous when they tighten these down, and it just puts that much clamp onto the roof, onto the lid of the carburetor, that it all gets bent out of shape. Because of the design of these, because you've got all these tubes and needles and whatnot coming out of here, you're kind of limited without stripping the entire lid down, and even then, you don't want to take too much meat off. You're kind of limited to how much you can bring these back to flat. So it's really important that you don't do too much damage and make those too tight. But outside of that, that lid's in good nick. The needles are where they're supposed to be. None of these tubes are here have been pulled out or anything, so yeah, no, everything's looking pretty cool there. Flat's a bit stiff. It's also got a bit of a squeak to it, but all of these sorts of things will be fixed up once they come out of the once it comes out of the ultrasonic. Accelerated pump plunger, nothing too fancy there. We get a new plunger cup in the Overhaul kit. I don't believe it comes with a whole new plunger, but if it does, so be it. Accelerated pump spring, nothing really fancy there. Doesn't get too grubby, doesn't get too dirty, so to avoid it getting lost somewhere, we're just going to chuck that in the tub. Accelerated pump check valve is underneath this screw here. Once we pull that out, we'll find there's a little ball under there. We should find a little ball under there. Here's our little ball under there. Yes, it is. Tip that upside down and out she comes. And of course we get another one of those as well. It's a stainless steel ball bearing. There's no place for dust or dirt to collect on them, so we'll just chuck that into the tub. Next stage, put the main jets out. Of course they can just go straight in the ultrasonic. Knew I'd forget something, my needle and seat screwdriver. It's got a nice fat blade on it so it doesn't destroy seats when I go to unscrew them. A little crush washer under there. We get a new one of them as well, so obviously just stick it in there for now. Choke housing can come off now, attached purely just by one screw. And it is a different screw, so this one screw will only go into one place in this carburetor. It's got a big fat washer under it. So yeah, that screw with the washer underneath it always goes into the choke cover, choke housing. Choke housing comes off. This little seal here, if you can see it, gets replaced when we do the reassembly, so that can go in the plastic tub. We don't need to clean it, obviously. The only other thing to come out is the little air guide out of the secondaries. That can get clean. And that's pretty much it for the top half of the carburetor. Oh, one more thing. Fuel inlet. 1 inch. Normally comes out pretty easily. You may or may not find a filter, and we have no filter. There is a nylon washer on the front of that. That'll be replaced. That one there. There's meant to be a filter, a little sintered bronze filter and a spring that goes into there, but they're not there, so I may try and hunt one down. The customer's actually given me another carburetor to see if it's of any interest to me. If it's got that in there, I'll put that in. But that's it for the lid. Turn her upside down and attack the base. Oh, there's that little bit of choke linkage we were looking for. On the base, 2 Phillips screws. Again, those 2 screws can only go one place, or 2 places in these carburetors, and that's into the base, so hard to mix them up. Idle mixture screws can come out, so we clean our idle circuits thoroughly. Each of them having their own little spring. These ones are uncapped. I would imagine they have never been capped. back when this vehicle was built. We weren't locked into too tighter emission controls, so probably didn't have them from the factory. Some of the later Holdens we get here in Australia, they do have a different later version of the carburetor, and they are capped. And this screw here is actually in a different location. It's got a different style of metering adjustment for the main circuit, but topic for another day. So number 2, mixture screw and spring into the dunk, and we should be pretty right to pull our base off with a gentle prying action, and away she comes. Get rid of this thing here, little makeshift tube cap that's on the back here, a screw in a bit of hose. Not a big fan of the hose myself. Intermediate gasket's a nice big thick chunky one of these. Again, no use keeping that, we just chuck it in the dunk. I'll take the idle screw out. Base idle screw can come out, so it gets a thorough clean, and I do like to just put a bit more tension on that spring during reassembly. I'll show you how I do that later. But that's our intermediate section, all ready to go and get cleaned. Idle jets, etc. I leave as they are in this unless it requires modification. Same with the secondary jets and needles. Very, very rarely do you need to make any changes to those things. But yeah, this is all ready to go in as is. So yeah, happy days there. And now we're onto the base. So, quite important. I'll get rid of that. That's our accelerator pump linkage, or the rest of the accelerator pump linkage. The secondary throttle valves in these are fine. The shaft doesn't have enough wear or slop in it to warrant rebushing, so I'm not going to leave that. I can see that sealing up nicely. Primary shaft, however, always rebush. For the amount of time it takes and the longevity you then get out of the carburetor after that, it's a no-brainer, so it always gets done. So you start by taking all the choke linkages, fast idle linkages off the back. Probably have a little bit of a bounce when it comes off. Screw, spring, fast idle adjustment, and choke step, or step lever. And once we're at this stage, what we need to do is take the tops off those screws, because they get peened over during assembly at the factory. So if you try to take them out without actually removing the peened over section on them, you will destroy the screw, and then you'll have to tap them out. It's not a showstopper, but it's completely avoidable if you just take a little bit more time. And all we do is put it into the vise. I'm not going to set the camera up over there, but all we do is put it in the vise like so, get a half round file, and just give them a bit of rub, just pretty much down to the level of the shaft. And once they're at that point, they'll come out quite easily. So here we are about a minute later. You can see those the tips of those screws are now gone. So they're down flush with the throttle shaft now. I haven't taken any meat off the throttle shaft. You can just see some witness marks where the files come across it. And hopefully these screws will come undone and out with no objection whatsoever. Again, this is something that people go in a bit hot-handed with these things and think, oh no, they'll straighten out when they come back, but they don't, because they're only a tiny little screw. You know, normally when I replace these, I tap them out to 1/8 Whitworth, and a 1/8 Whitworth screw is a small screw, so we're talking smaller than that. So they're a very small and very delicate screw, but there's no reason that they should not make it through the overhaul. Throttle discs come out. Always check the ends for wear. They're not looking too bad at all. You can see there's just the tiniest little bit of a witness mark there, but I can't really say that it's bad enough to warrant replacing, so I'm happy to continue on with those. The secondary valves can come out. On some of the later versions of these, they use a different style of secondary lockout that actually locks the throttle valves instead of just the air flap at the top. It's a better system, and you don't have to take the secondary throttle valves out just to rebush the primary throttle shaft. But we've got to do that here, so out they come. And out comes throttle shaft assembly. Both of those come out quite readily once that's done. We're left with our base. The only last thing to do is what I've been requested to do on this, is to remove the factory sealed mixture screw here for the cruise mixture. Normally you're not supposed to touch that, but this is going to be an off-road car, so I'm going to pull it out. So I managed to get them out, lo and behold. That's our little screw there. So it goes in, moves that lever, adjusts the base setting of the needles while you're on cruise. Yeah, it came out pretty easily, thankfully. So plugs out, that's out. This is all ready to go into the ultrasonic. So once it's all clean, see you on the other side. Rightio folks, welcome back to the bench. As you can see, everything's nice and clean. I've gone already and put the base back together. I was sort of in two minds to whether to show the assembly of it. There's a fair bit of fiddling, so I think putting a throttle base together, because of the amount of fiddling required and the potential repercussions if you get it wrong, I've decided that hopefully one day I'll make a separate video just detailing the assembly of a 4-barrel base. But for now, she's all back together, all the linkages are there, it's been rebushed, everything is back where it needs to be. Now, something you may or may not be able to notice, depending on the vantage point and how well it comes out on the film, is that the secondary throttle flaps are not opening up exactly vertically. Probably going to make a heck of a lot of difference, but while we've got it apart, we may as well make everything right. So getting that right is purely a matter of just tweaking this linkage here. Now there's a bit of a knack to being able to do that. I like to use a little baby set of multi-grips here and just grab onto that, and we need to just lengthen that linkage a tiny bit so that it just gives a bit more travel. Takes very little, so I just gave that the slightest little tweak, and as you can see now, it's opening up beautifully parallel to the primary, so that's where it needs to be. So working from the bottom up, of course, going to put our idle mixture screws in with their respective springs. I normally just give these a little bit of a squeeze just to get a little bit more tension on them. My baby little side cutters through them and just open them up a little bit, so when we put them back in, they hold a little bit more pressure and are less likely to wriggle around. I'll just put a little bit of lube on there just to keep them nice and clean and protected. And we bottom them out. And as a basic starting point on these carburetors, I normally come out about 2.5 turns. So that's bottomed out there. It's not just bottomed out on the spring, that is actually seated down below inside the idle discharge. So we come out 2.5 turns, so 1, 2.5, and same with this one. Again, seat it, and we come out 1, 2.5. Now, something else I did before when I was reassembling the base is put our little cruise mixture screw back in its place. I counted the amount of turns when removing it and I've just put it back into that same position. And what that does is sets the height of that little lever there, which is what the power piston bottoms out on when you're on cruise and your manifold vacuum's at its highest. So this one, for reference, was sealed, factory sealed, and the setting on it was 13.5 turns out before it came out of the thread. You can't always move them. This one could move, which means I was able to get that lever down and machine this face. Sometimes that lever has to stay where it is because the screw's completely seized in there, and a lot of the time that means that we can't really machine this surface because we'd end up taking the top off that lever. So just something to look out for. So I'm going to put the base to one side now, and I'll prepare the intermediate section. I'll prepare the body for being mated back up. Grab our intermediate gasket out of the kit. Quite simply sits down over everything. Little locating lugs, and they're a good solid fit to where they're supposed to sit so they don't fall off. Once that's done, you can go ahead and invert your beautifully reconditioned and set up base onto the body and put those two Phillips head screws we were talking about before in their position. So like I said, during disassembly, the only two Phillips head screws on this model of carburetor, and they just hold the base onto the body or intermediate section, so they just get nipped up. Remembering all of these carburetors are aluminium bodies, so it doesn't take too much to strip them. And that's our body and base, ready for the next stage. So while we're at this point, again working from the bottom up, I'm going to put our idle speed screw in there. Again, just give the spring a little bit of a tweak just to put a bit more tension on. I'm using lift grease, but any sort of decent spray grease will work. WD-40 is not a lubricant, so don't use that. It disappears in a matter of minutes. And at the moment, I'm just going to set that so we just start to see the throttle move, and then I'll go another one turn, and that'll get us to a cracked position so the throttle valves aren't resting closed, and that's normally a good spot to start with. Main jets can go in now, just back where they came out of, obviously. You can try and put them somewhere else if you want, but they ain't going to go there. If you do manage to get them fit in somewhere else, well, hey, congratulations to you. Obviously all of these galleries, after they've come out of the ultrasonic, wash them out, flush them out with water, blow them out with compressed air, flush them with water again, another hit with compressed air, so we know that they are definitely nice and clean. Next thing to go in will be our accelerator pump check ball. We got a new one of these in our overhaul kit, and we just drop that into there. And put our screw on top of there. There's no spring that goes in there, it's purely gravity operated. Again, that just gets nipped up, seated down firmly. On the topic of seating and seats, we can put our needle and seat in now as well. So we got a new one of those in our overhaul kit as well. So we've got a little crush washer that goes underneath, and a suitable sized screwdriver. You don't use these just in one side because you'll end up cracking the brass off and bits and pieces go in everywhere, and it's just bloody unprofessional. So use a proper size screwdriver and grab our little hook, attach that to the needle like so, get our float hanger. Again, the float just was hand cleaned, hang our needle on there, and when everything lines up, it all just drops into place like that. And to set our float level, we want that float to be sitting about 1/4 of an inch down from the lid of the carburetor. It's just a little bit high there, so I'm just going to give that a little bit of a tweak just until she lines up in the right spot. It's now topping out just a little bit, well, 6mm is nearest down to 1/4 of an inch, so pretty happy with that. So that's our float set. Next thing to go in at this stage is our power piston and main needles. This is where things can get a little bit fiddly. As I said when I was pulling this apart, this little collar here is designed to hold the piston down in that little hole there. But as time goes on and things expand and contract 2 million times, they don't grip on as tightly as they used to. So all I normally do with that is grab a flat blade screwdriver and a suitable sized hammer and just give it a couple of little peens. I normally go with 3 because it looks nice. Okay, so putting the power piston back in now that we've got our little sections peened over. Put a little bit of lube in there. Drop our power piston spring in. Line those needles up, which you probably can't see from here, but basically just making sure that they go down into the jets where they're supposed to sit. Little baby pair of pliers, just push down on that ring, and there you have your power piston moving beautifully where it's supposed to be. Very nice. Okay, we get a new accelerator pump plunger with this kit. So there's really not much to putting that in, other than we need to bring our accelerator plunger spring in. We also just need to take the retaining washer and spring off the old plunger. Now that will go into a low Earth orbit if you let it fly off, so make sure you hold that at the time that you take it all apart. This one here, surplus to requirement, put it over the old plunger, or the new plunger rather. Put our lock washer on, and there we have our new plunger ready to go in. One of the few places I do use CRC and WD-40. And at this stage, you may or may not be able to hear it, but I can actually hear that check valve moving, which means that we've got an accelerator pump circuit. But if you're not certain, you can just squirt a little bit of this goop here into the bottom, and when we do this, you'll see it come out of those pump channels. That's how you know that your accelerator pump circuit is working before you continue with your assembly. Okay, so we're just about ready to put the lid gasket on. I've gone and put the air flap in, the air vane, call it what you will, air guide, into place. That does need to go on before the lid gasket because there's a couple of tiny little retaining lugs or retaining tags on either side that do need to sit under the gasket. You can put it in after, but it will damage the gasket, so put that in now. Yeah, needles, everything's ready to go. Just got to put our little baffle in that we spoke about earlier. Pump plunger back in, and our lid gasket comes along now. Now, this is a little bit fiddly, but after a couple of decades of experience, this is what I've always found the easiest way to do it. With the needles, when we put them in, and we make sure that they're moving as much as they need to, if we try to do that afterwards, once the gasket's on, you just don't have as much of a visual and you don't have as much access, and trying to get those needles into the jets with the lid gasket on is virtually impossible. So the gaskets come prepared for this. There's a little section there they've got a couple of cutouts, so you can see the piston goes there, needle, and so what we need to do is delicately put this into place, slide the gasket back a little bit and under the hanger like that, lock it down with those two little tags there. Our piston still moves as much as it needs to. It hasn't impeded the float. Plunger we can deal with later, but now we know that the lid gasket's in place and everything's where it needs to be, rather than trying to fumble around with those needles and put them in afterwards. It's a no-brainer, but I have seen people try to do it that way. Okay, so moving along to the lid, when I pulled it apart, I showed you the warpage that had happened on this, just due to age and people being overexcited when they tighten them down. So what I've done is I've machined the face as flat as I possibly could. Now, when I say as flat as I possibly could, I don't like going to the length of pulling out all of these tubes. Because you risk damaging them if they don't want to come out. You crimp them with pliers or whatever, or whatever you use to pull them out, you're at risk of damaging them, especially these ones. So I leave them in place. The back of these bodies very rarely gives any issue at all. The air flap's moving nicely, and I've put the straight edge across the back of it, and it's really in very, very good nick. So we don't need to go to the length of pulling the back of it apart. However, the front was in pretty crook shape, so I've done my best to flatten that as much as I can, down to maybe 1/4 millimeter. At that amount, it's you're taking minimal off. You can see there's areas where it's only just started to touch here. That way I know it's getting bloody close to seating, and the gasket's going to take up any of that clearance. But due to the inherent design of this lid, it is really not worth your trouble of pulling all of these tubes out and risking damage of them, when all you really need to do is just get this front section here flat enough to be able to seat nicely on the gasket. So I'm going to put this lid on now. At this stage there's not really anything else that needs to be attached to it. All we need to do is put our pump plunger in, gently lower it into place, and you'll find that it will pretty much find its own home. There's those 6 tubes there. If you get any resistance at all, they're not in the right place. So it's really very simple to put this lid on and not damage anything. So now that we're home, I'm going to start to screw it down. And you can see that there's 3 different types of screws for this lid. So there's the 2 long ones, obviously they go at the back. 4 of these ones that are about, so I'd say about 1 inch in the thread, they go through the midsection. Got 1 that goes in the front, and then these 2 tapered ones obviously go down into the primary venturis. So I normally like to start from the middle and work my way out. So that means starting with these 2. Drop these 2 in. Now I don't completely tighten any of these until I'm ready to nip them all down. So I've got most of the screws down and just lightly seated at the moment. This one at the front will be our last one, if I can keep the screwdriver in the slot. And now we'll just go around and seat them gently. So again, we're dealing with aluminium and steel screws and some nice flat faces that don't need a ton of pressure put on them. So we don't want them to come loose, but at the same time you don't need to reef the hell out of them. Okay, where were we? Now, the lid's on, it's all nice and tight. You can probably hear our accelerator pump is working beautifully. Secondary air flap on this. Now it does have an interlock on it here for when the choke's on. That's how this particular model locks out the secondaries while the choke is on. Until the engine gets up to operating temperature, then the choke releases and we're able to activate the secondaries. Now, this did have, the observant ones amongst you may realise that things have changed a little bit here. It did have a bit of a jam, a bit of a bent shaft, so I've actually taken that shaft out off camera and given it a straighten, and it made that work a lot better than it was. It was squeaking and groaning when we pulled it apart. I thought it was just going to be a matter of giving it a bit of a tap here and there and a bit of a tweak, but it actually had quite a decent bend in it, so I've taken care of that and we're ready to move on. So our secondary needles can go back in. The cam is doing everything it's supposed to do there. It's in the right location. A hanger is very straightforward. Putting these in is nowhere near as fiddly as the primary needles. Once these get through the lid gasket, they'll just fall straight into place. And then it's just a matter of getting the correct screw, which is this nice tiny little sucker. And now we've got secondary needles that work. Accelerator pump. Now this linkage is held in place by a simple roll pin. I don't normally go to the trouble of removing it. It just pushes to one side and you can get the linkage out quite easily. They're not something that wears out regularly. I'm really not too concerned about it, so I'm going to leave the one that was in there originally in there. And just set up our linkage on the throttle shaft. And we get our side cutters. And we just slide that pin over. And that's all there is to it. So this is a good time to put the choke flap linkage on. Now it's a bit fiddly and you may struggle with this, but what we need to do is get this little organisation of linkages here to hang down in the right place so that when we put the housing on, everything lines up and our linkages work. So alrighty, so I've got the choke housing on. There's really not that much to getting that on. I had a bit of a camera failure and I didn't realise that it had stopped recording, so apologies for that. But as far as fitting the choke cover, all you need to do is put your choke flap linkage on, line it up with the linkage through the housing shaft into the eye of that linkage, and you're pretty much laughing. So you can see that's all lined up and doing everything it's supposed to do. So now we're going to put the choke cover on, and as I said through disassembly, you're pretty safe in just putting this into its factory setting, and if you need to adjust it, then by all means do, but normally the original factory setting, which is that little line mark there lined up with the center mark in the housing, that's where the setting was made from the factory. So stick with that, and 9 times out of 10 you're going to be fine. Now it is important that the gasket on this seals well, because it uses engine vacuum, uses manifold vacuum to draw just a whiff of exhaust gas from the manifold in through this fitting here and then down in through the carburetor, just so that it heats that coil up properly. So if you don't have vacuum inside that, in other words, if this has a leak, it's not going to draw that hot air up. Instead, it's going to leak around there and just bring you in ambient temperature air, and your choke's not going to function properly. So make sure that that gasket and this housing seal very, very well. Quite important to the correct operation of the choke. So we're now at a position where we should be able to mimic setting the choke on the vehicle. So when the owner of this vehicle gets in the car and does what they're supposed to do, they'll have fuel in the bowl, give it one crack of the throttle, the accelerator will set the choke. You can see the choke flap is now 100% closed. It will of course have a bit of a mechanical pull off there if you need to, in case it floods, but that's where we want it. It's got just the right amount of tension on it, and we're ready to put our choke pull-off assembly diaphragm on, the CPA diaphragm. Okay, so we're going to put the CPA diaphragm on now. So this is a CPA diaphragm is a choke pull-off assembly diaphragm. So what this does is when you start the engine cold, it will have manifold vacuum applied to it, which will pull this diaphragm back, pull this lever back, and actually adjust the choke to a position where it can start to, it'll basically lean the choke a little bit, pulls the choke off a bit to stop the engine from over choking once it's started. So as soon as the engine starts to run under its own steam, this flap will open up a little bit, and the rest of the choke coming off is done by the heat coming into the choke housing from the exhaust. So very important that this functions correctly. Now looking at this is the original linkage. It's the right linkage, but it is bent to shit. Now there's meant to be a few bends and whatnot in it, but not quite like this. So someone's had a bit of a crack at it and done a fair bit of damage. So I'm gonna have to give this a bit of a tweak as we go to straighten it out, and just bring it back to a standard where it'll oh my god, where it'll do its job properly. So I might go off camera because it's just going to be a bit tedious. So once I've got this back straight, we'll pick up from there. Alrighty, hope you can see this and it makes sense to you. I decided I'd do a bit of a close-up on setting up the choke, the CPA diaphragm anyway, the choke pull-off assembly. So as I described, its main purpose is to pull the choke off a little bit once the engine starts to run. So it's a fairly important part of the automatic choke. Another thing it does is also regulates the rate at which the secondaries open as well. So it's got a couple of purposes, and they're both very, very important to making sure this engine runs well. So I've got my vacuum pump on here, and I'm going to apply the equivalent of manifold vacuum to it. So around about 17 to 21 inches of vacuum, just enough to pull it all the way back. Anyway, you can see that's opened it to what I would consider a pretty good place actually. Around about there is what I'd say would be good. Once it's up and running, and it's running on its own, that'll be where it sits. So it should be plenty of choke for it. Now, as far as the secondary control, what is important is the rate that this releases at. So it does have a very small orifice at the end of the fitting where the vacuum hose goes onto it, and that is to regulate the speed at which it comes off, which in turn regulates the opening rate of the secondary air flap. So what we need to do is make sure that when it is when the engine is at high vacuum, so when it's at cruise or at idle, that this linkage is holding that air flap shut completely. So if I take the interlock out there, you can see that they're able to open well, you know, probably let's say about 30%. No good, because that means as soon as you dump the throttle, that air flap's just going to go whoomph, and probably give you a gigantic flat spot. You're going to go nowhere. So we'll set it properly, and to adjust this part, it's purely just a matter of squeezing this little section of the linkage here together, or opening up, and all I need to do is bring that up to a point where it just touches there. Now, even if the interlock's open, that air flap can't move because it's being held back by our CPA diaphragm. So if we release the vacuum off there, I'll just take the hose off it. Now they'll open fine. So, very important that these things are set the way they're supposed to be and not tinkered with. Everyone seems to think that they know better than the manufacturer, but quite simply, you don't. You've got a professional carburetor designer that's put all the thought and the work into this. Now, I'm not saying that metering and whatnot can't be changed, but when it comes to interlocks and lockouts for secondary diaphragms and secondary flaps, leave it work the way it's designed to work, and your car will be just that little bit nicer to drive. It'll be a bit more predictable, it'll be more reliable. So we're getting pretty close to home here. Everything's, choke and everything's operating the way it's supposed to be. The CPA diaphragm is fine. It did have an idle speed solenoid on it, so I will put that back to where it's supposed to be. Now, on this carburetor, I'm not sure if this is an air conditioning idle speed solenoid or an idle solenoid. If it's an idle solenoid, the job of it is to basically set your idle speed, and then when you switch the ignition off, this becomes de-energized, and it allows the throttle to come back just a little bit more closed, so that it can be, so that we don't have run-on issues. Okay, so we're pretty much there. All I've got to do now is put our fuel fitting in the front. Put that in there and nip that up. Idle solenoid's back on. Put our air filter gasket on. Base gasket. And she's ready to ship. Hope you've enjoyed this, folks. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up. If you want to see more of this sort of stuff, please do the right thing and subscribe. I will try my hardest to get more of this stuff out of here. But in the interim, I really do hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got any questions or comments or additions, let me know down below, and I'll try to get back to them when I can. But in the meantime, thanks again for watching, and we'll see you back in the Hilltop workshop very, very shortly. Cheers. Bye-bye.